In the previous chapter, we looked at using hook form alter in order to make simple changes to forms, changing things like the label on the user registration form. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at some more advanced form theming techniques. What I'd like to do is make some changes to the comment form on our site. When we're viewing an article on the site, we have the ability for users to leave comments, and they do so by filling out this simple form at the bottom. It's a little bit ugly right now though, and I'd like to clean it up. What I'd like to end up with is something that looks a bit more like this. I'd like to have the your name and subject fields on our comment form in line with one another, and I'd also like to remove the extra filtering tips from underneath this comment text area. I think it just makes the whole thing look a little bit better. So let's take a look at how I would do that. The first thing that I'll do is on our actual site, I'm going to turn on the Devel Themer tool in order to inspect this form and see where I might jump in and start theming things. I can turn that on, and I can select any element within this form, and then I can use the Devel Themer tool in this parents part up here to start going back up the tree and figure out which element I want to theme. In this case, I'd like to theme the form, so I'm going to select the form here. Then I can see that the form is using this function to output the HTML theme_form. Clicking on that function will take me to the documentation for the theme form function on api.drupal.org. And once I'm there, I can look at this documentation and say, this function returns the HTML for a form, and I can take a look at it, and this is basically what it does. It goes through and it renders out the different elements for our form, returning the HTML. In this case, this isn't particularly useful. I could override the theme_form function in our 960 robots theme, but what that's going to do is actually change the output for every single form in Drupal. I want to change the output for just the comment form. So in order to do that, I need to take a couple of extra steps in order to have a theme function that's targeted at the comment form. Let's take a look at the documentation for some of the form generation functions. I'll click here on form generation. This gives me a list of all of the functions that are used when generating a form in Drupal 7. The one that I'm interested in this case, Drupal prepare form. Let's take a look at this function and see what it does. The Drupal prepare form function is called as part of Drupal's form API whenever a form is built and presented on screen. If we look at the code inside of the Drupal prepare form function, one of the things that we'll notice is that down towards the bottom is this section of code here where we're checking if not is set form #theme, then go ahead and set that #theme property to the unique ID of the form that's being displayed. This is nice because what it's doing is adding a #theme property to this renderable element so that when this form is themed using render or Drupal render to display it on the page, Drupal will check the theme registry to see if there is a function named theme_, the unique ID of this form, in the theme registry. And if there is, it'll use that to display this particular form. And if it doesn't exist, then it'll use the standard theme_form function. This will give us the ability to target specific forms for theming, like the comment form. If we switch back over to our site, we can take a look at what's already in the theme registry for our site. The Devel module provides a handy block with some links that will allow us to inspect the existing contents of our theme registry. Let's go ahead and enable that block. So if I go to Structure and turn off the Theme Developer tool just so it's out of the way, then Blocks. The Devel module provides this development block. I'm just going to add that to my first sidebar. You can see up here it'll show in the first sidebar. I can click Save and close the overlay to refresh the page. And now in my sidebar, I should see the development block. And one of the links in this block is this one here for theme registry. I can click on that, and this will give me a big list of the entire contents of the theme registry for my site as it currently exists. Modules and themes in Drupal add contents to the theme registry by implementing hook_theme. They do so to declare that they have certain things that are themable, and once they've done so, those different things, like the breadcrumb here, or comments, or nodes, and so forth, can be overridden by a theme, overriding a theme function like theme_breadcrumb, or using a template file like node.tpl.php. If we look at this list right now, we can see there are a couple entries related to comments, but none of them for the comment_form. So this is telling me there isn't anything in my theme registry currently that would allow me to create a function, theme_comment_form, to modify the output of the comment form. So what I need to do is inside of my 960 robots theme, I need to add a new element to Drupal's theme registry using the hook theme function. If I take a look at the documentation for hook theme on api.drupal.org, we'll get an idea of how we can implement that. Implementing hook theme, just like all the other hooks we've seen so far, is done inside of our template.php file, and is simply a matter of naming conventions. If we read the documentation for this hook, we can see that what it does is register a module or theme's theme implementations. And then it gives a description of all the parameters. It basically needs to return an array of arrays, declaring something as themable, and then providing some information about the default implementation of that theme function or template file. Under return value here, we can see that there are two things that are required: variables or render element. And actually, if we read even further, we can see only one of these is actually required. You either need to return this variables key or you need to return the render element key. In our case, we're going to be dealing with render elements. Our form is again a renderable array, so we're going to be needing to provide information about the render element. If we scroll down, we can see an example of how you might implement hook theme. Generally, when I'm implementing a hook, one of the things that I'll do is just copy and paste the example from the documentation and then go ahead and make changes to it inside of my theme. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to copy this example implementation of hook theme, and then I'm going to open up the template.php file for our 960 robots theme. And then I'll go ahead and paste that copied code into my template.php file. The first thing that I'll do is rename this, again, based on a naming convention. I want to replace the word hook here with the name of my theme, 960 robots. Once I've renamed this function to 960 robots_theme and gotten this nice function signature here that I copy and pasted from Drupal.org, I'm going to go ahead and actually just delete the contents of the function that's currently there and paste in the code that we need in order to start theming our comment form. The way that the theme registry inside of Drupal works is that the first time someone views a page on your site, Drupal builds up a registry of all of the possible theme functions and templates that it knows about. It does so by asking every single enabled module and every enabled theme if it implements this hook_theme function. So Drupal is asking your theme a question, and it's saying, do you have anything that you would like to add to the theme registry? When we return this array here, we're saying, yes, I would like to add this comment_form element to the theme registry. So I'm declaring this form, or this element, as themable, something that can be overridden by the theme system. Hook theme takes a couple of arguments you can see here. These are primarily useful when implementing hook theme inside of a theme. Let's take a look at the documentation again real quick to see what this input is into our hook_theme implementation. On api.drupal.org, the documentation for hook theme shows us each of the parameters that are input into the theme. $existing is an array of existing implementations that may be used for override purposes. So this is useful for themes when they want to examine the implementations provided by another module or another theme and make changes to those or create a new themable element based on something that already exists. $type shows whether this is a theme or a module that is being processed. And it says this is useful so that themes can tell if they are the actual theme being called or a parent theme. And it may be one of these possible options: module, base theme, theme engine, base theme, or theme. $theme is the name of the theme that is being processed, or the module if it's a module. And finally, $path is the directory path of the theme or module so that you don't need to look it up. This is useful when inside of your hook theme implementation, you need to declare the full path to something like a template file. All right, back inside of our template.php file, let's look at the code that we're actually returning from our 960 robots_theme function. We're returning a multi-dimensional array. we've got an array with a key of comment underscore form, and the value of that key is another array with this key of render element with the value of form. Comment underscore form here relates to the name of the theme function that we'd like to use in order to theme this form. So what this is going to do is tell me that the candidate theme function name is theme underscore comment underscore form, or the overridden version of that would be 960 robots underscore comment underscore form. You leave off the word theme underscore because Drupal uses this portion when it's doing the lookup to determine whether or not the theme is providing a theme function or Drupal itself is providing a theme function. So what Drupal will do is actually say, the currently enabled theme is 960 robots. Is there a function named 960 robots underscore comment underscore form? If there is, I'll use that. If there's not, is there a theme function named theme underscore comment underscore form? If there is, I'll go ahead and use that. So all of this is used to build up the theme registry. Finally, we're saying that the thing that is going to be themed inside of this comment underscore form function is a render element. If you remember, our forms are actually just a subset of the renderable arrays in Drupal. So every form is a renderable array or a render element. We simply need to say that the thing that is going to be themed is a render element, and the name of that variable is form. I'm going to go ahead and save my template.php file. Then I'm going to switch back over to our site. I've implemented a new hook inside of my template.php file, hook underscore theme. In order to get Drupal to register that, I need to clear the cache first. So I'm going to go to the Performance tab, clear all caches, and then I'm going to go back and view the contents of the theme registry again. So I'll scroll down and click on the link in the development block here for the theme registry. It looks like it's not actually showing up yet in here. I suspect what's going on in this case is that because we're viewing this output of what is in the theme registry inside of the overlay, it's being viewed as an administration page, so it's using the 7 theme instead of our theme, 960 robots. So what we're actually seeing here is the theme registry for the 7 theme and not for 960 robots. To confirm that, let's go ahead and change our site so that it uses 960 robots as the admin theme and disable the overlay, and then see if we can get this theme registry to print out what we're expecting. I'll do 2 things. I'm going to go to the modules page, and I'm going to scroll down and disable the overlay module. Click save. So now all of these admin pages will appear just as normal pages and not inside of that overlay pop-up, including the pages like that theme registry one output by the devel module. Then I'm also going to go to appearance here, where we change all of the settings about our themes. And I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to say here under administration theme, I'm going to tell it to use our theme 960 robots for all of the administration pages. So pages like this one where I change settings for something, or the page where I create a new node, and so forth. I want it to use the 960 robots theme for all of those pages too, instead of the 7 theme. I'll click Save Configuration. And now, if I go back to the home page, and then back to a node on our site that has a comment form on it, so where we were before, and I click to view the theme registry here, there we go. So here's our output inside of the 960 robots theme, instead of inside of the 7 theme. And if I tip this open and start to inspect what's in it, I bet we'll find our comment form. Yeah, there we go. So now comment underscore form is appearing as something that's in the theme registry. So now, when somebody goes to view a page, like this previous page, that contains the comment form on it, and Drupal needs to print out this form, what it'll do is check to see if there is a function named theme underscore comment form or 960 robots underscore comment form, some implementation of that theme underscore comment form function for this form. And if there is, it'll use that to output the form. And if there's not, it'll fall back on using the default theme underscore form. So now what we can do is implement that function inside of our template.php file and take control of the HTML output for this form. Let's go ahead and do that. Back inside of my template.php file, I'm going to create a new function This is going to be a theme function. This is no different than when we say overriding the theme function for breadcrumbs, where we made 960 robots underscore breadcrumb. But in this case, we're overriding the theme function for the comment form theme. I'm going to say 960 robots underscore comment form. And then all theme functions take one argument, $variables. The first thing I'm going to do inside of this new theme function implementation is just print out this variables argument so we can see what's inside of it. I'll use the kpr function to do that. Save my changes, and if I switch back to the site and hit refresh, I can inspect that variables variable. So variables is an array with 3 elements. Inside of that array, this element named form, one named attributes array, and then theme hook suggestions. So somewhat similar to what we've seen inside of theme functions so far. Form here contains the actual form API definition of the form that's going to be rendered to HTML and then printed on the screen. This is, again, very similar to the render API stuff that we've seen before. Elements and then properties, or things, a pound symbol here, are properties that define how these particular elements are going to be turned into HTML. If I look at the contents of this form element, I can start to get an idea of what's inside of it. I can scroll down here and I can see that there are some elements like author and subject and comment body. These map to the different fields that are printed out on our form, the author field, the comment body field, and so forth. What I'd like to be able to do inside of our theme is render the author and subject fields individually, so that I can wrap them in additional HTML to get the desired output that I'm looking for. I then want to make sure that I also render all of the other parts of this form, like this comment body element, which is the text field, the submit button at the bottom of the form. But in addition to that, I need to make sure that I'm rendering all of the elements on this form. There's a couple of important ones here that might be easy to miss, like form ID or form token. These are used by Drupal's form API in order to ensure security of your forms, so that when they're submitted, it knows that you're actually submitting the correct form, and for some validation tasks. So we want to make sure that these are rendered when we render out the form. Otherwise, when somebody clicks submit on the form, it might not work as expected. Okay, so we've got the author element and the subject element. Back inside of our template.php file, let's take a look at how we can render those elements individually. The Drupal API contains a couple of functions used to render elements that are part of a renderable array. When theming forms, in this case, we're going to look at the function Drupal_render. Let's take a look at the documentation for that. The Drupal_render function takes one argument, an array, and it renders HTML given a structured array. So this is the function that's responsible for taking those renderable API arrays, things like the form array or the page array that we've seen before, all of those different renderable things. Drupal_render is what actually does the work of turning them into HTML. So we're going to use this function to render individual elements. I'm going to start out by rendering the author and subject elements into their own variables. So let's create a new one named author, and then we'll say Drupal_render, and we'll render the author element. We'll do the same for the subject element as well. We'll say subject, and then we'll just render the subject element. One of the things that the Drupal render function does is keep track when it's rendering things inside of this array, which ones have already been rendered and which ones have not. So when I say Drupal render on this author element or on the subject element, it'll flag those as having been rendered to HTML already, and it won't render them again. This is really nice because then I can say render these two specific elements, like the author and the subject, and then I can use another function in order to render everything else that's part of this form array that hasn't already been explicitly rendered. It's a lot like using the hide and render functions inside of a template.php file. So I'll create one final variable named everything else, and then I'll use the Drupal render children function to render everything that's left inside of this form array. When calling Drupal render children here, I want to make sure that I'm doing so on the entire form array and not just a specific element. This will make sure that it gets all of the pieces of that array, like the form token and the form ID that we wanted to make sure get printed out on the page. Finally, I can go ahead and return these things from our function. Return author, subject, and everything else. Right now, I'm just rendering these things out individually and then concatenating them back together and then printing them out or returning them. All of these theme functions, Drupal expects them to return rendered HTML. So that's what this is doing here, rendering this to HTML and then returning that string. Right now, our theme function isn't really doing anything other than what Drupal does by default. It's simply rendering this form into HTML and then returning that string. We can take a look at what that's doing though if we switch over to our site and refresh the page. So, like we expected, it doesn't look any different currently. We can inspect any of these elements, and if we look at the HTML output for each of them, we can see each of these elements gets wrapped in a div with a class of form item. Here's the individual input element, so in this case our subject field or our author field. And then all we did was render the author field and subject field separately, but then we just combined them all back together in the end. What we can do now, though, is start to add some additional HTML to this form in order to help spruce things up a little bit. If you'll remember, what we wanted to do was try to get our author or your name field here and our subject field in line with one another. So instead of spanning two lines like this, we'd like them right next to each other. Using the 960 grid system, this is actually pretty easy. We can just wrap each of these elements in an additional HTML div with a special class, and they should line up for us. So back in our theme function, I can just start adding some additional HTML to the rendering of this form. So I'll do that. So adding this additional code here, where I'm creating an opening div before rendering that element, and then the closing div. What this author variable will contain now is a div that I just created with the author element inside of it. I can then do the same for our subject field. And then I can give each of these a class that will work with our 960 grid system in order to get them to line up appropriately. I'll give this one a class of 3. And because it's the first element in this row in the grid, I also need to give it a class of alpha. And then I'll give this one a class of grid 3. So each of these elements will now take up 3 spaces in the grid. And then this one, being the first in the row, will have some additional styling applied to it just to make sure everything lines up appropriately. I can click that, save that, switch back to our site, and click refresh. And there you can see our 2 fields are now lined up, one right next to the other. And if I inspect one of them, like the subject field here, I can see that it is indeed being wrapped with that additional div with a class of grid_3. The author field here is an additional div with the class of grid3 and a class of alpha. The other thing that I wanted to do was show how we can hide some aspects from this form. I wanted to hide, just as an example, these fields right here that relate to choosing what text format someone's going to use when they're submitting a comment. This is pretty easy to do as well. I can inspect the variables here from our KPR and keep drilling down. So we've got variables and then form, and inside of form, we'll find our comment body element. Keep scrolling down. Inside of comment body, there's this element UND, or undefined. This relates to the translation system in Drupal, undefined being there is sort of no defined language other than the default at the moment. Inside of that UND element is another element named 0. You can see these form API arrays especially start to get pretty deep. But again, all of this is just a big renderable array. Drupal will recurse through all of this and turn it into HTML. I keep drilling down. I'll eventually find this element here named format. Format is the field set that contains that select list and the options for choosing what format or text format I'd like to use when submitting this comment body. All right, so I know where that is inside of my array now. Let's see how we can hide that element. Back over in our template.php file, I just need to add a line of code to my 960 robots _comment_form function to hide that format element. What I'm going to do is right before calling Drupal render children here, I'm going to use the hide function to hide that format element inside of the array. This is just like using the hide function inside of our template files from the basic theming videos, but we can say hide on any element inside of a renderable array, and then when we render that entire array, Drupal will simply skip that element and not print it out. So we're just going to go ahead and hide the format element. If I switch back to our site, click refresh, great. This is looking much more like I wanted it to. Now we've got our two fields lined up, our comment body field, and the format element is not printed out on the screen any longer. We're still seeing our save button and our preview button, and if we were to inspect this form, we would also see the hidden form ID and token and so forth that are needed in order to ensure successful processing of this form when it's submitted. The last thing I need to do in order to finish cleaning this up is remove that KPR so we're not printing out the elements array here any longer. I can switch back to our code to do that. It's as simple as deleting that line from our function. So what we did was create a new theme function in order to theme the comment form. There was a couple of steps that we had to go through in order to do that. The first thing we had to do was implement hook theme inside of our template.php file. So that's this code here. 960robots_theme is our implementation of hook theme. When we did that, we declared comment_form, or the unique ID of this form, as a themable element. We also saw by looking at the code for Drupal_prepare_form, the function that is responsible for building all of the forms in Drupal, that this method will work for any form in Drupal. Because what it does is assign a theme function with the name of the unique ID of the form to each form. As long as the function exists, it'll use it and you can theme the form. If it doesn't exist, it'll fall back to using Drupal's default theme_form function. So inside of our template.php file, we actually had to make sure that that element existed in the theme registry. That's what we've done here. And then we were able to declare that function inside of our template.php file. So we've got 960robots_comment_form, which is the theme function responsible for outputting the comment form. Inside of that, we use the Drupal render function to render individual elements from the form array and assign them to a variable. We did that with both the author and the subject field, and then we were able to wrap those in additional HTML in order to achieve the layout that we wanted. We then used the hide function to hide an element from the array format here. And finally, we used Drupal_render_children to render everything that was left inside of that form array. So anything that we didn't explicitly render gets rendered by this Drupal render children function. It's important to remember to do this because if we didn't, even if we had rendered things like the save and preview button manually and then printed those out, we still might miss things like the form token and the ID and some of these security things that are needed in order for forms to work in Drupal. So always remember to render the entire form using Drupal_render_children. That's sort of the very last step here. And then finally, our theme function just returns some HTML that gets printed out to the page and is the form that users fill out when entering a comment.